Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG CV. My name is Helena Emanalo, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. A copy of the slide deck and recording will be emailed to all attendees. Next slide, please. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers if possible throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. And alongside our presenters, we also have several HCV staff, including ESG representatives, ESG CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. So today's office hours agenda includes the following. We have ESG and ESG CV updates, office hours updates, upcoming trainings, ESG, ESG CV Q&A, and our Spotlight Series presentation for today, Match Clinic. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Sarah for our ESG updates.
Thank you. Good morning, afternoon, wherever everybody's from. Just a few updates. The 2021 contract standard agreements are still routing. We have 41 executed out of the 60, so only a few left. So please remember when you're getting the email notification from eCivis stating that your award is ready to be accepted, that you have to download a copy of the STD 213, which is your contract, have it signed by the authorized rep, and you need to upload that into the system prior to it clicking accept award. Otherwise, this will delay the process and our contracts office will send it back to you. If you have been awarded homelessness prevention funding and you have not turned in your updated policies and procedures for us to review and approve, please do not forget to do so. We will be sending out reminders via eCivis this week, and we'll have a due date by the end of this month. Remember, we will not reimburse any HP expenses until the process has been completed. If you have questions or concerns in regards to the policies and procedures for HP, let us know. You can contact us at esgnofa@hcv.ca.gov. Again, avoid recapture. There is that 20% expenditure milestone deadline, which is 120 days from the execution date of the contract. That is in your Exhibit E of your standard agreement. So I know quite a few counties are coming up on their deadlines. A lot of people have already met them. Thank you to those that have already started turning in their request for funds and their detailed expense reports. So if your contract has been executed and you need help navigating the eCivis system to complete the RFFs or to add additional people from your agency to manage the award, please reach out to us at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov, and we will provide specific TA to you. Next slide, please. Again, avoid receiving STD 209s and reimbursement delays. All of the 2021 contracts are managed in eCivis. All requests for funds have to be submitted through eCivis. So please do not email the request to your representative. For every request for funds, it also must include a completed detailed expense report. And we will be conducting mini monitoring for every reimbursement request. So what will end up happening is you will submit your request for funds and your detailed expense report along with your narrative in eCivis. And once the rep has reviewed your detailed expense report, they will then contact you to let you know which line items that they will be choosing for the mini monitoring, as well as a complete client file if it does have to do with rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention, and I know we will be getting into emergency shelter at some point. So reminder, all supporting documentation that is requested by your rep has to be redacted and submitted through the secure SharePoint site. So the mini monitoring documentation does not go into eCivis, and that is noted in HCD's PII policy. So please make sure to have your supporting documentation ready to submit when you turn in your request for funds and when requested from your HCD representative. Next slide, please. Update on 2022 applications. All of them are currently being reviewed. Our team has already reviewed the recommendation packages and all of the COC-AE applications. We currently are on reviewing the non-competitive apps. We expect to have all of the applications reviewed and completed by November, so we can still announce awards in December. The ESG reps will start sending some of the applications for the COC-AE and non-competitive this week back to draft for corrections. So watch out for that email. If you had only turned in a draft resolution and now have your executed signed resolution, please reach out to us at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. And remember, you cannot add people from your organization to view that application until a contract is executed. So that would only apply with adding people if your contract is executed for 2021. Next slide, please. And ESG trainings, be on the lookout for all ESG trainings to be located under the webinar trainings icon. Next slide, please. And we do have new policies and procedures. I know that you all get so excited over this. Make sure that you are reading through all of these manuals and policies and procedures, because moving forward, we will be asking for all updated policies and procedures, just like we are for the homelessness prevention. Next will also be the street outreach, rapid rehousing, and emergency shelter. So our new rapid rehousing manual and manual checklist is on our website under the resources tab. Please make sure you take time to read through that so that you can update your policies and procedures accordingly. Next slide, please. And once again, our team representatives, Diana Prado, Giovanni Martinez, Tuesday Poole, Sam Liu, and Anthony Zepeda. If you have any questions, concerns, or need help with anything, please make sure you reach out to your ESG representative listed above, or you can contact us at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. Thank you very much. Turning it back over to you, Helena.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And now I have just a few ESG CV updates and reminders. California received approximately $3.8 million in reallocated ESG CV funds. HCD management is currently looking at options for distribution, so please stay tuned. Next slide, please. Upcoming office hours topics. On October 19th, we have shared housing. On the 26th, there's youth homelessness. On November 2nd, we have written standards and policies and procedures review expectations. And on November 9th, we have ESG CV grant sunset. And please visit the training site to register for office hours. And you can find all previous office hours recordings on the YouTube link provided on this page. Next slide, please. So we have upcoming trainings this month. On October 20th. We have case management, which is a community workshop series, case management best practices and rapid rehousing. And we also have a racial equity series, othering. So if you would like to register for those upcoming trainings, please register on the link provided on this slide. And for any previous trainings as well, you can always visit the YouTube link provided on here as well. Next slide, please. For additional COVID response resources, please use the resources on this page for infection control measures and CDC and NHCHC guidance. Next slide, please. Next slide. For monkeypox resources, please feel free to use the following links for additional information. Next slide, please. And for additional ESG guides and resources, be sure to check out the link on this page. Next slide, please. Any questions? Oh, we have a question from Amanda Kennedy. She asked, are we currently working with our ESG clients and program and it's working very well, but we're almost out of funds? Do you know if they're currently working on getting more funds in the future? Connie, can you answer that question, please?
So we are, if you're interested in adding funding to your current ESG CV contract, reach out and let us know. Reach out to your grant administrator. We're compiling a list, and we should know. We'll know in a while as far as how much and as far as money we would have to add to some contracts. So, but real important that you reach out to your grant administrator. Let them know that you would like some more funding and what activities you would like that funding in, and then we will add you to our list. And then we'll be in constant communication with everybody about as we know more down the road as far as what we have that we could add to some existing CV contracts.
Thank you, Connie. We have another question. Just wanted to clarify, someone came in, let me see. In the future, we will be required to submit our policies and procedures for housing. Sarah, can you answer that question, please?
You're going to be required to submit your policies and procedures for surrounding all of the activities. So for emergency shelter, street outreach, homelessness prevention, and rapid rehousing. Hopefully that answers the question. Currently, we're only requiring the HP policies, but obviously if you have your written policies and procedures in place and they meet what the checklist for each one of those policies and procedures that we have on our resources page, please make sure you send them to us as soon as possible so we can review them and approve them, or have you make the corrections needed. Because moving forward, like I said, we will have to approve those. Once they are approved, then you will not have to change them unless we have additional changes or revisions to our policy.
Thank you, Sarah. We have another question. Someone said, not sure who our administrator is. Would that be our HR? Connie, would you be able to answer that question, please?
Do you want to repeat the question, Helena?
Yes, I'm not sure who our grant administrator is. Would that be our HR?
Your HR, not sure. Your grant administrator be the contact that you've been working with your ESG CV contract. We can get that information to you. Oh, I see somebody. See, do we get somebody that responded to that? We can
Sorry,
get that in.
that Veronica is with Mendocino County, and so I believe she is the administrator for Amanda's organization.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, if you have any further questions, please contact us, Annual ESG. You can reach your ESG representative or contact the ESG NOFA HCDCA.gov email address. And if you are ESG CV, please reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Chris for today's Spotlight Series presentation on Match Clinic.
Thank you, Helena. We'll actually have the Match Clinic today by Gordon and Mike, who will teach us about match funds and its key concepts. Gordon and Mike, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. So hello, everyone. I'm Mike Thomas. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a technical assistance provider with ICF. I'll be presenting today with my colleague, Gordon. Do you want to introduce yourself really quickly, Gordon?
Sure. My name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he, him. I am white and Jewish, and I am also a lead homeless services specialist with ICF. Happy to be here with you this morning.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, we will be covering the topic of match today. I do want to specify here, we have one slide in the presentation that says this, but I know people come and go throughout, so we want to make it very clear. This is applicable to annual ESG funds. Match requirements have been waived for ESG CV. So if you only receive ESG CV, you're welcome to not listen to me from this point forward. This does not apply to you. But if you have or plan to apply for annual ESG funds, this is applicable. So only annual ESG funds. Next slide, please. So let's start off by defining match. What is it? Next slide. So these are the key concepts around match. Match is the share of costs not covered by the ESG program that the recipient of those funds is required to contribute to accomplish the purposes of the grant. Match requirements are usually specified in statute, in regulation, and or your grant contracts. So you'll find it in one or more of those places. Match funds can be used for activities that are eligible under the grant contract. That's a very important key concept. If you're not spending the money or using the resource on something that is eligible under the contract, it is not necessarily going to be eligible. There are some nuances around that. It has to be an ESG eligible expense, and we're going to talk about that as we go through this. Match can be cash or it can be in kind. Most sources of match are eligible, provided that they are not prohibited for use as match by the source of the match. I want to note here too, if you happen to go back and look in the ESG regulations, you might see language saying that match is the non-federal share of costs. That can be a little confusing because in this context, we're talking about non-federal specifically in the context of ESG as the federal source. There actually are numerous sources of federal funding that can be used as match towards ESG. So just want to clarify that. We're really talking here, in this context, non-federal means costs that are not paid with ESG program funds. And then recipients may pass some or all match requirements to subrecipients with some nuances. So what that means is California HCD is the primary recipient of the ESG grant, and then they subgrant those funds, and the match requirement is passed along to subrecipients. Next slide, please. So cash match. With cash match, the recipient or subrecipient spends actual money on eligible ESG program costs. Cash counts as match only if you can demonstrate that a payment of funds was made to cover the cost of the ESG program eligible activity and expended during the grant term. And cash match can come from a variety of sources, and that includes things like grants from private, local, state, and federal sources. Again, if it's not statutorily prohibited by the source to be used as match. It includes cash resources, so think like your general fund, revenues from fundraising efforts organized by the organization, and recipient or subrecipient staff working on grant eligible activities who aren't paid from ESG program grant, but are paid from other agency resources. So in other words, if someone is working on the ESG program, but you are paying a part of their salary out of, say, your general funds, that could be match. Next slide, please. And then there's in-kind match. In-kind is the value of any real property, equipment, goods, or services contributed to the ESG program grant that would have been an eligible ESG program activity if you paid for them directly with ESG program funds. So donated things that would have been eligible under ESG if you had purchased them with cash. In-kind match can be donations provided directly by the recipient, subrecipient, or a third party, and it can include things like donated buildings, donated materials, and volunteer services. And there's nuance around a lot of that as well, which we're going to talk about as we go through this presentation. Next slide, please. The bottom line with match is that prior to ESG CV, there was not a ton of ESG funding out there nationally compared to other sources. And so the idea was, to leverage other resources and maximize the impact of the program. So that's kind of the goal. You've got your ESG program funds, then leveraging other funds and bringing them into that project to make the program as successful as it can be. Next slide, please. And over to you, Gordon.
All right, thank you. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the match requirements of the ESG program. Next slide, please. So as we said earlier, this was everything in the slideshow really, everything in this presentation about match applies only to annual ESG. The match requirement for ESG funds was waived. There is no match requirement for ESG CV. As Mike said, if you have only ESG CV and you do not ever anticipate wanting, needing, or asking for annual ESG, you can turn your ears off if you like. But for those of you who have or want annual ESG, please continue paying attention as this applies solely to you. Next slide, please. All right, match requirement. ESG subrecipients, so that would be folks who receive money directly from HCD, are required to provide match equal with are required to start that sentence all over, are required to provide match equal to 100% of the grant funds that they were awarded. So if, for example, a recipient was awarded $10,000 in ESG funds, they are required to provide $10,000 of match. The match requirement is based on the total amount awarded and does not need to be broken down and provided on a component by component or an activity by activity basis. So some examples. The one on the screen in front of you is if a subrecipient receives $10,000 in ESG funding under the HMIS program component, they do not need to provide $10,000 of match via an eligible activity under the HMIS component. You don't have to match $10,000 of HMIS program funds with $10,000 of HMIS match. It can come from anywhere. It can come from rapid rehousing. It can come from admin. It can come from anywhere else in the ESG program. This is also true at the individual activity level, and these are sort of the two most common mistakes that folks make with match, besides trying to recognize as match things that are just not eligible. If you, for example, in rapid rehousing, provide $100,000 of rental assistance, your match does not need to be in the form of $100,000 of rental assistance from a non-ESG source. It simply doesn't work like that. And so you do not need to match activity to activity. So federal funds to, or rather ESG federal funds to match funds, activity to activity. You don't need to match rental assistance with rental assistance, case management with case management, and you don't need to match program component to program component. You don't have to match HMIS to HMIS. You don't have to match rapid to rapid. It's all coming. It's all ultimately matching the amount that was awarded to the subrecipient. The subrecipient gets $100,000 divided into 5 different program components. They have to provide $100,000 of match, either in cash or kind, from whatever eligible source under whatever program component. And I'm harping on this because it's a thing that folks get wrong constantly, and it is entirely to their detriment. So we're trying to equip you to know better on the front end. Next slide, please. So match eligibility requirements. Matching funds are contributed to the ESG program and expended for allowable ESG costs. That's what Mike was touching on earlier. What it means is for match to be, for a cost to be eligible to be recognized as match, it has to be spent on an ESG eligible cost. There are ways in which this is obvious. So for example, if you are paying your case manager's salary, who's doing ESG activities 100% of the time, half their salary is coming from ESG funds, half of them is coming from match dollars, which could be private donations or whatever, then yeah, that's obviously, you're fine. That's an obvious yes. This gets a little trickier when you start thinking about people who are enrolled in your project who need things that are not eligible ESG costs, but are still very valuable to them. And so one of the common pitfalls is you might have somebody enrolled in ESG rapid rehousing. And rapid rehousing can provide rental assistance and case management and housing search and placement and an assortment of other supportive services. But there are a lot of supportive services that rapid rehousing, ESG rapid rehousing does not provide. That are not eligible costs under ESG. For example, if your participant needs a 30-day inpatient stay, which you cannot pay for with ESG rapid rehousing, or anywhere, incidentally, under ESG, even though the participant needs it, even though it is important to them maintaining housing stability, that cost cannot be recognized as match because it is not eligible anywhere under the ESG program's participant serving projects. So there's your example of what you can spend, what you can recognize as match, what you can't recognize as match. If the matching funds are from another federal program, that is probably possibly fine. There is no statutory prohibition on using other federal dollars as match for ESG, as long as the destination source says that it's okay, and as long as the activity is eligible under ESG, you're golden. A really good example of this is that both ESG and the COC program fund HMIS activities, and the activities that they fund for HMIS are basically identical. And so ESG HMIS funds and COC program HMIS funds, while both being federal, are a great source of match for each other because they fund basically the same activities and neither of them prohibits matching the other. Matching funds must be used in accordance with all of the requirements that apply to ESG grant funds, except for the expenditure limits that are specified in the interim rule, which includes requirements like documentation, eligibility, eligible costs, participant eligibility, and so on. We can get into the weeds on that, or you can just hold the idea in your head like this. Match has to be spent on ESG stuff, ESG participants, ESG eligible costs, the ESG project. Can't be spent on things that aren't ESG. That's the easiest way to remember it. And in general, that guiding principle will get you to the place you're trying to go. Finally, matching funds have to be expended, and expended here means that the allowable cost has to be incurred, not the money has to go out the door during the ESG contract period of performance. So if your contract period is January to December, match can only be an expense can only be recognized as match if it occurs between that same January and December. If it occurs in the following January or February or March, it cannot be recognized as match. Next slide, please. Eligibility requirements. So matching funds have to be expended by the expenditure deadline that applies to the ESG funds being matched. ESG funds have an expenditure deadline, and you can't you cannot recognize as match costs incurred after that deadline, same as you can't recognize costs incurred after the performance period of the contract. Matching funds that are recognized by ESG cannot be, will not be, and have not been, must not have been used to match any other federal programs funds or any other ESG grants. In other words, if you're using an expense as match for ESG, you can't use it as match for anything else. Basically, that there are nuances there, but that's the right way to think about it. Again, the recipient, so that means HCD, doesn't use ESG to meet the other programs matching requirements. Again, what we're talking about is not duplicating funds. And finally, the recipient, which is to say HCD, has to keep records of the source and use of the match, including the fiscal year ESG grant for which the matching contribution is counted, which means ultimately where you're applying that match. This is relevant because ESG is granted in 48-month cycles, but contracts are usually awarded on 24-month cycles, and they're awarded annually, which means at any given time there are roughly 2 ESG grants active with HCD at any given time, and so HCD needs to keep track of where the match went to. As subrecipients, what you care about on this slide is you have to spend, the match has to be incurred during your project year, your contract year. The contract year should, in theory, match the expenditure deadline, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. If you recognize something as match for ESG, you can't use it as match for something else, and HCD will come knocking to keep an eye on the sources and uses of your matching funds to make sure that your records actually reflect the match eligibility, that you have eligible match, and that will probably occur during the monitoring process. Next slide, please. Other stuff. Match may only be counted as match once. So this seems obvious, but there are ways in which this can be misinterpreted or misunderstood. The big one here is if you, for example, receive a donated building, you do not get to recognize as match the amount that you would otherwise have spent on rent in perpetuity every month forever. You get to count the value of the donated building as match once. On the other hand, if a landlord is kind enough to donate to you a lease on a month-to-month basis, you could recognize each month of the donated lease. Let's say that the lease amount is $5,000. If they say, okay, we're going to waive that every month, you can recognize the $5,000 that they waive every month during the month in which it is waived. But if they were to donate the building to you for, let's say, $500,000, that is a one-time recognition. And you can't say, okay, well, we're going to depreciate that. We're going to recognize $5,000 of that expense once every month forever. It's a one-time expense that you recognize once during the contract period it occurred in. In addition to which, contributions to match that have been or will be counted as match for another federal grant or award, again, can't count as match for ESG. If you're using it as match for something else, you can't use it as match for ESG. Next slide, please. We have no attribution markers, so I'm going to go ahead and keep on with this one until I see something else. So program income as match. Program income treated as match must be treated as match. That requirement lives in the interim rule in section 576 407C, as you can see on your screen. You can go ahead and look it up, but just trust us, it's there. What that means is if you have program income under ESG, which is unusual and occurs most often in the form of security or utility deposits that are returned by a landlord to the recipient or the subrecipient, they have to be recognized as program income and used on the program that they are returned to. Note here, however, this does not imply, should not be taken to imply, and we encourage you not to. You don't have to keep security deposits. So if you provide a security deposit under rapid rehousing, you as the subrecipient do not, at the end of the participants, let's say 12 months in the program, don't have to go back to the landlord and say, all right, give us everything that's left of the security deposit. You shouldn't do that either. As a recommendation, It is generally a best practice to leave the security deposit with the participant so that the participant can use it to get a leg up on maintaining permanent housing after they exit the project. This is good for the participant. It's also good for the subrecipient because you are now avoiding a situation in which you have to account for incoming program income. You have a whole get with the landlord and reclaim the security deposit loop that you don't have to do. And then you don't have to account for program income separately and ensure it goes out the door correctly. It avoids a lot of problems for you for not very much money while equipping a participant with a valuable source of money when they are going to need it most, transitioning out of your program. ESG regulations state that program income has to be used as match to supplement the ESG program. What that means is you got to use it on the program it came from. Finally, to qualify as match and therefore to be compliant, program income has to be spent on ESG eligible costs. Again, you got to roll it back into the project and it needs to be spent on eligible costs. Next slide, please. All right, match restrictions. Because match is contributed to the ESG program and expended on allowable ESG costs, the following things are not eligible to be used as match. SNAP benefits, such as food stamps, because the funds are being used to cover the program participant costs, not the program's costs. Housing choice vouchers, or also called Section 8, or anything under the Housing Choice Voucher Program, including, let's say, emergency housing vouchers, because the funds are being used to pay the Public Housing Authority's obligations under its housing payments contract with the owner. And the tenant's portion of the rent, if the tenant is required to share in the rent, because this amount is the tenant's obligation, not program funds. Next slide, please. Match restrictions. Home TBRA cannot be used as match because the requirements for rental assistance are significantly different between home TBRA and between ESG. Specifically, home TBRA cannot require a participant to accept any services, but ESG Prevention and Rapid must require program participants to meet with a case manager at least once a month. COC funds are not statutorily prohibited from being used to meet the match requirements of the ESG program. However, the recipient and the subrecipients must ensure that all match requirements are fulfilled, including the use of match funds for eligible program costs and participants. Very broadly speaking, COC funds are not usually a good match source for ESG. HMIS funds are an exception because the eligible costs are basically the same between two programs. They have a tendency to be good sources of match for each other. Other than that, in theory, you can match ESG Rapid and ESG COC. I'm sorry, ESG Rapid and COC Rapid. But there are, while the programs are 90% the same, they're 10% different, and the 10% is a pretty big gap, meaning that both projects, both funding sources would need to alter the way they do business in fairly significant ways that mean ESG and COC program rapid projects are not usually good match for each other. Not always, but not usually, and we advise you to go very cautiously. Next slide, please. Over to you, Mike. Oh, we've got a question that I'm just going to cover while we've got it. There's a question about Home TBRA. Home is another program offered by HUD to help low-income families. TBRA is one of the program models that Home uses. TBRA stands for Tenant-Based Rental Assistance, which is also one of the program models that ESG Rapid Rehousing provides. And so Home TBRA is just one of the many sort of other housing subsidy programs that HUD operates that you'll see floating around. I think that pretty well covers that. So over to you, Mike.
Yep, perfect. Thank you. So now we're going to talk about documenting match. So we went through all these requirements. How do you show that you're meeting them? Next slide, please. So you must keep records of source and use of match funds, including the fiscal year of the ESG grant. So, you know, in your case, you're thinking about the contract period of performance. So you have to keep records of that. During the course of the grant, you must document the expenditures paid for with cash match to demonstrate that the funds were spent on eligible activities. Expenses for cash match must meet the same documentation standards as those paid with federal funds. If you take nothing else away from the documentation stuff we're about to talk about, take away that. the way that you would document how you're spending your federal funds should also be how you document your match expenditures for cash match. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of cash match documentation. For salaries and benefits, this is one that people get confused on this one pretty frequently because these three things I listed here can look different from agency to agency, but there are essentially three pieces to documenting salaries and benefits. There is something like a payroll register, which shows how things were paid. And then there are your timesheets, which shows how funds were allocated amongst people, and then how the percentages of people's salaries that were charged to ESG. And then finally, you've got your internal accounting records that show how that cost allocation was applied. For rental assistance, we're thinking about the lease rental assistance agreement, the gross rent versus fair market rent, and rent reasonableness documentation. And then we're thinking proof of payment. So that includes things like canceled checks and your accounting records showing that you accounted for those payments. For utility payments, we are thinking the actual utility bill, and once again, proof of payment. So canceled checks and accounting records. And for supplies, you want detailed receipts showing items purchased and the cost of each item. And then, just like the others, proof of payment. So, a canceled check, a credit card bill that has been paid, and your internal accounting records. Next slide, please. Documenting in-kind match is not quite as straightforward. So I'm going to spend more time on this one. So document that in-kind donation was provided. That's your first step. You have to show that the in-kind donation was actually provided to your organization. Then you have to record the value of that donation, and we're going to talk a little about how that's calculated, and then ensure that the donation was used for ESG eligible activities. Next slide, please. So for valuing in-kind match, to determine the value of any donated material or building or of any lease, you have to use a method that is reasonably calculated to establish the fair market value of that thing. Services provided by individuals must be valued at rates consistent with those ordinarily paid for similar work in your organization. And if there's no one doing similar work in your organization, then the rate must be consistent with those ordinarily paid by other employers for similar work in your labor market. I will note here, I do not endorse any particular source, but there is a source I'm aware of called Independent Sector. If you look at that on Google or wherever you search for things, their website will provide valuation for volunteer hours. It's often a good resource for valuing people's time. If non-cash contributions would have been indirect costs, and this is a very complex topic, which I'm not going to get into the weeds with, but if it would have been an indirect cost, matching credit must only be given if you have established a special rate for allocating these costs to individual projects. So in other words, if you are using internally an indirect cost allocation strategy, you have to use that for your in-kind match as well, if it's indirect. Ultimately, you must develop a policy for valuation of in-kind contributions and follow that policy consistently. You will not find anywhere in the federal regulation or really in many other places that I know of anything that says specifically, this is how you have to value this specific thing, because there can be variation from place to place and market to market. You just have to have a sound policy for determining those valuations, and then you have to follow that policy consistently. Next slide, please. So documentation for in-kind goods and equipment. Written documentation of the donation of in-kind goods and or equipment must be provided on the source agency's letterhead. It must be signed and dated by an authorized representative of the source agency and must at a minimum include the following. So the value of the donated goods to be provided, the specific date that the goods will be made available, the actual grant and fiscal year to which the match will be contributed, the time period during which the donation will be available, allowable activities to be provided by the donation, and the value of commitments of land, buildings, and equipment. And the value of these items is one time only, as we mentioned before, and cannot be claimed by more than one project or by the same project in another year. So if a building is donated, if equipment is donated, you can claim that as match once. We want to note here that HUD has not released the ESG virtual binder on match yet. So we took this language from the COC program virtual binder. There is some chance that there could be variation when the ESG binder is released, but this is what we have at this point, and it is a high standard. And we want to note that this high standard will ensure that match documentation requirements are met until we get that virtual binder for the ESG program. Next slide, please. So some considerations for donated property. Values of property and equipment must be established in accordance with the federal cost principles. So we're talking 2 CFR 200. That's the federal cost principles. Your finance staff should be familiar with that. The value of donated property and equipment will generally be the lesser of the value of the remaining life of the property contained in the donor's accounting records at the time of donation. So if the donor can tell you the remaining life of that property, that's a potential value. Or it is the fair market value established pursuant to the recipient or subrecipient's policies. So if you have a policy for establishing value and you get a value of the remaining life from the donor, the lower of those two is generally going to be what you go with for this valuation. The value of donated land and buildings must not exceed its fair market value at the time of donation. That is the maximum that you can claim for match on those items. Next slide, please. The value of donated equipment must not exceed the fair market value of equipment of the same age and condition at the time of donation. The value of donated space must not exceed the fair rental value of comparable space established by an independent appraisal of comparable space and facilities in a privately owned building in the same locality. And the value of loaned equipment must not exceed its fair rental value. So the bottom line here is we're thinking about the fair market value of these things. You can't claim more than that for match. Next slide, please. And so let's talk about documentation for in-kind services. Services provided by individuals must be valued at rates consistent with those ordinarily paid for similar work in your organization. If there's no one doing that in your organization, then you have to look at the rates paid for those by other employers for similar work in your labor market. Services provided by third-party partner agencies may be valued in writing by the partner agency on agency letterhead signed by an authorized representative. So in other words, if you partner with an agency to come to your agency and provide some service that's eligible under ESG, and they tell you what that service is worth, how much they would generally charge for that, then you can use that as the value. Written valuation of services from a third party should at a minimum meet the same standards that we described earlier for goods and equipment. Formal MOUs may also be used to establish the value of donated services. And in fact, that is kind of the gold standard. So if you have an ongoing relationship with someone that's bringing services into your agency and you use those as match, having an MOU with them is going to be the cleanest way to establish that. Next slide, please. And so here are some examples of in-kind match documentation. So for donated supplies, you want documentation of the donation, the use of the supplies, and the valuation, a letter from the donor, receipt, policy on valuation of donated supplies. These are all things to think about when you are documenting it. For volunteer hours, you want documentation of the actual hours, activities performed during those hours, and the valuation. And so for these things, we're thinking about things like a sign-in sheet to show that people were actually there, daily log showing how many hours they worked on which activities, things like that. So a daily sign-in sheet works, volunteer log, and then your policy on valuation of volunteer hours. So when you know the hours, you know what they were spent on, you then have to value them, and that's going to be based on your policy for how you do that. Donated professional services. You need documentation of the services provided and the valuation, and that's generally going to be something like an MOU or a letter from that agency on their agency letterhead. And then that's going to have to follow, again, your policy on how you value things like that. So you have to have that policy, you have to follow it. For donated space, you want documentation of the fair market value for similar space, the calculation of the space used for ESG. So if you're donated a building, but only a couple of rooms are used for ESG eligible activities, the space in those rooms is the only amount. That's the square footage that you can count as match for ESG. So that's a really important thing to note. You can only count the whole building if the whole thing is being used for ESG. And then other documentation you think about here is an independent appraisal of the value of such space, documentation of the space allocation to the ESG program. So again, if it's only part of the space, you have to document how much of the space is being used for ESG purposes. Next slide, please. Okay, we are going to get into our lightning round and just ask a few questions to see how we're doing with match. And I believe my co-presenter had to jump off, so my other colleague, Chris, is going to jump in and help out here.
Yes, thanks, Mike. We actually have a question before we get to lightning round I thought we would address just as a matter of course, and I wondered if you could help me with the answer. I lost it. This from Anne. For the policy where we're letting participants retain their security deposit, would we need to have a policy, something written down to support that?
I think that would be best practice. There's nothing in the reg that says you have to have that, but I think for consistency's sake and for being able to show how you handle that situation, I think it would be a best practice to have a policy. Yes. Great.
I agree with that question, that answer 100%. It is always better to write it down. And as Gordon mentioned, we encourage you not to create more work for yourself by making this program income. It is a benefit to the client, to you, to the landlord, to everybody, not to pull that money back and make it program income, because that's a whole nother level. So yes, Gordon had to depart, so I'm going to be filling in for the lightning round. We know these questions are very tricky. They're designed to be so. We're going to pull out very specific pieces of what either Gordon or Mike said in very specific things, and then give you the rationale behind it. So I know they're not easy. I don't know is always a fine answer, but we'd love you to give it a try if you can give it a go. So let's go ahead to the next slide, and I think the first one will be mine. Aha. All right, so here is the first question. A local ESG subrecipient accepts a donation of bedroom furniture to help an RRH participant get set up in her new apartment provided through the ESG project. The agency values the donated bedroom set at $500. Can the agency use the bedroom set as match for the rapid rehousing project? You have a poll that just popped up. Your answers are yes, no, I'm not real sure. So we'll give it a second. Go ahead and answer those questions, and then we'll give you the answer and the rationale. We are, yep. I was going to say we're seeing something weird in the slides. So we'll wait for those slides to pop back up before we give you the answer. We have most of you have responded. There we go. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop the poll. So over half of you said yes. Let's go ahead and reveal the answer. We were tricky on purpose. So no, we cannot use this because of the rule that Gordon, I might have been Mike, mentioned before. If you can't pay for it with ESG, you can't use it as match. So no, the furniture cannot be used as matched. Donated goods can be used as a good source of non-cash amounts, but it has to be for an eligible RRH cost, and furniture is not. All right, second tricky question. Mike, I believe you're up.
Yep, that'll be me. So a local property owner provides one leased unit free of charge for 12 months as a donation to an ESG rapid rehousing subrecipient. A participant in that project will reside in the donated unit for the 12-month period. Can the fair market value of the free of charge lease count as match towards the ESG rapid rehousing project? And I know we're getting short on time, so if you guys want to throw those answers in there, tell us which one you think. It's always okay to say not sure. And we have no idea who is answering what. It's completely anonymous, so feel free to throw your guesses in there. We will not know who you are. Most of you said yes, so let's see what the answer is. Very well done. Yes, a donated lease is considered a non-cash contribution, and rental assistance is an eligible cost under rapid rehousing. Note that the subrecipient must pay close attention to the time frame of the donated lease and how that aligns with the rapid rehousing contract's period of performance. The best practice here would be to recognize each donated month as it occurs to make sure that the match is allocated to the correct ESG contract. So if you have a contract that say ends in June and the next one starts in July, if you're recognizing the rental amount that the property owner would have charged month by month, then you make sure you're accounting for it in the correct month and applying it to the correct contract. Next question, please.
All right, question number 3. A local hospital has agreed to write off the cost of inpatient stays that are less than 3 days for participants in the subrecipient's ESG street outreach project. Can the ESG subrecipient count the waived costs of inpatient hospital stays as match towards its street outreach project? Yes, no, I'm not sure. All right, looks like, oh, yep, we're getting a definitive answer. Over 70% of folks said no, this cannot be matched. Let's go ahead and reveal the answer. Nope. That was very astute. Inpatient treatment is not eligible under street outreach. Medical costs are only eligible if they're outpatient, provided in a community-based setting and not otherwise available or accessible. So you are correct. It is not something that is eligible for ESG. It means it's not something that is eligible for ESG match. Back to you, Mike.
All right. Next question. So this is a tricky one. I'm going to throw that out there up front. A person has received an eviction notice because she is behind on her rent. She's behind on her rent because she lost shifts and the concurrent income as a result of her car breaking down. Her landlord has agreed to halt the eviction if she pays the back rent, which she could do if her car was repaired. So a local ESG subrecipient uses their general flexible cash provided by a donor. So this is kind of like general funds. They use cash that they have on hand to pay for the car repairs. So they are paying for this recipient or for this person's car repairs to get them back to work so they can pay their rent and halt the eviction. Can the ESG subrecipient count the cost of these car repairs as match towards its homelessness prevention project? Yes, no, or not sure. I cannot see how the answers are coming in. Now I can. A few people said yes, but we had a majority, a little over 50% saying no. So let's see the answer. That is correct. No, they cannot be used as match. While the participant is eligible to be served by homelessness prevention, car repairs are not an eligible cost under prevention. And as such, the cost of the repairs cannot be counted as match. So again, it's the eligibility thing. However, this is a great example of a space where ESG can't be involved, but flexible funding can have a significant impact. So if you have flexible funding, it's a good way to use it. And last question, please.
All right, we'll do this quick because we're almost at the top of the hour. A restaurant runs a dinner program at the local ESG funded emergency shelter every Friday night. The restaurant provides volunteers, servers, and cleaners. Plus they bring the food, flatware, and everything else you need. If the restaurant were not providing servers and cleaners, the shelter would be paying $15 an hour for those services. Can the shelter recognize the weekly value of servers, cleaners at $15 an hour plus the actual cost of food, flatware, etc. as match? Yes, no, or not sure. All right. We have 60% of folks saying yes. Let us see the answer. Yes, this is eligible for match. Food, supplies, and necessary for dispensing the food, and the staff time to prepare, serve, clean, all eligible costs under ESG. They are in kind, but when donated, the shelter can put together in-kind value for those things. In fact, we have, I believe, in our match policy, some supporting documents that help you do in-kind match and document it so that we can monitor it. With that, we'll go to the next slide. And I don't believe we have time for Q&A, so I'll just hand it back to LaQuante to close us out.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Mike and Gordon, for such a rich presentation. Everyone, remember that a survey will pop up at the end of this presentation. If you would please weigh in with your thoughts, we'd greatly appreciate it. And we thank you all again for being here today, and we will see you next week.